Hello and welcome to the Trump Report. I'm Louis Sykes. Today we're joined by the Times Washington correspondent George Grylls, who's calling in from the US. George, thank you very much for joining me today.
Good morning from over here.
You've been keeping across the US National Guard troops being deployed to the LA amid these protests over ICE arrests. What have we seen these guardsmen doing in California?
Well, they started being deployed on Sunday morning ahead of expected protests in the afternoon in Los Angeles. Trump originally called up 2,000 of them. It seemed like there were about 300 who were basically protecting federal detention centers where undocumented migrants were being taken. They were expecting clashes and they were basically trying to keep protesters away from those sites in downtown LA.
And there have been some pretty violent-looking scenes here, as these guards, National Guardsmen, and sheriffs as well, try to get a handle on this. What have we seen tactics-wise that they're using?
Well, it's kind of called euphemistically non-lethal, which basically means tear gas, rubber bullets. They have these flashbangs, these kind of stun grenades. It's everything below the threshold of actually kind of firing actual guns with live rounds in them to disperse the protesters. And these are the sorts of scenes that Democrats have feared because they think they're basically walking into a trap, a showdown with Trump, and that these kind of images of lawlessness and rioting play right into Trump's hands. And particularly when people see, images of protesters waving Mexican flags, they fear that this has all been set up basically by Trump as a very kind of visual reminder of the kind of stark divide between Republicans and Democrats.
And can we just go back over how these protests started? What caused them to become so seemingly quite violent?
So since his inauguration, Trump has promised this kind of very aggressive approach to pursuing illegal immigrants, and that's kind of come in waves. And most recently, in the past week or so, ICE, which is the kind of federal agency that goes and pursues illegal migrants, has been kind of conducting raids on workplaces in particular. So employers, businesses, shops suspected of employing lots of illegal migrants have been targeted. And what that means is that you get these kind of heavily outfitted, basically in riot gear, police descending on diverse neighborhoods across the US and kind of rounding up a bunch of people and taking them away. And that's obviously led to clashes. And in LA, those were the protests that were probably more severe than anywhere else in the US, certainly over the weekend. But the bonus is that obviously California has this liberal reputation. It's got a Democratic governor. And so for Trump, this gives him a showdown with a kind of very obviously Democratic city over his signature immigration policies.
And it's, of course, not the first time we've seen the National Guard deployed to put down protests and unrest in major US cities. Obviously, how does this compare to events like the LA riots or even the BLM protests only a few years ago, which, of course, was also under Donald Trump?
So there's one big difference, and it's basically so the National Guard. There's one in every state, and it's basically a military reservist unit. It's part of the military, but it kind of comes under the jurisdiction of the state in which it's based, while also ultimately serving the commander in chief, aka the president, aka Donald Trump. Now, usually when the National Guard is deployed, that's because the governor, the state, has basically said, we're in trouble here. We need your help. Can you, send some troops? In this case, Trump basically ignored the governor, Gavin Newsom, and said, no, this is a chaotic situation. We're sending in the troops, regardless of what you want. And you have to go back 60 years for the last time this happened. So that gives you a sense of kind of how unprecedented it is. And basically leads to a showdown between, the authority of a state versus the authority of the union and the president.
As you say, George, Trump has got something of an adversary, doesn't he, in the Californian governor, Gavin Newsom. What's the history between these two men?
So Gavin Newsom he's widely tipped to kind of run to be the Democrats' presidential candidate in 2028. He's a quite suave guy. He's a businessman who owns a lot of vineyards in Napa Valley, which is famously liberal part of the West Coast outside San Francisco. He used to be the mayor there, and he has already grinded Trump's gears. They've had various showdowns in the past, so over the policing of the border with Mexico. Obviously, California has its border with Mexico. Over the wildfires earlier this year, and if you look throughout Trump's kind of history, he's always set himself up against, whether it was Crooked Hillary back when there was Hillary Clinton, or Sleepy Joe when there's Joe Biden, and now a real sign that Gavin Newsom is joining the kind of pantheon of his Democratic rivals and adversaries, his antagonists that he likes to play off against. If you look at his Truth Social over the past few days, all he's been talking about is Gavin Newscum, as he calls him.
There's actually a bit of debate in the Republican Party about whether Trump should really be going for that classic style of setting himself up against a big Democratic boogeyman almost.
Yeah, well, I mean, they're thinking about, they've got the midterms coming up next year when they want to hold on to the Senate, and they're looking forward to presidential election in 2028. And the big question and answer at the moment is, are we going to have some sort of democratic crisis where Trump tries to engineer some way in which he can run for a third term? Obviously, president's time limited to 2 terms, but he's been kind of ambiguous about his intentions, and he's kind of teased the prospect almost of having another run, and how he would kind of force this issue, maybe if he would kind of give way to someone else and then run as vice president and take over, or there is there's gossip, there's murmurings about the sort of mechanisms he might use, but Trump governs in campaign mode, and it's not sure. It's not basically. I mean, we're 3.5 years away from the next presidential election, but it's not clear whether or not he's campaigning for himself personally, campaigning for the Republicans more broadly, or this is just his style.
And do we think some of that adversarialism between the governor of California and Trump is bleeding into this decision to send troops there, or is Trump just concerned about the protests that we've seen?
Well, Trump will say this is, a state resisting what is one of my kind of federal policies, and something that's been endorsed by the voters, which is, this immigration crackdown. But the Democrats basically think it's a trap. They think that he knew when they were launching all these raids on kind of diverse neighborhoods in inner city parts of the US, that it was inevitably going to lead to friction, and that he was basically orchestrating a showdown where he could kind of intervene, and he'd have the pretext for kind of taking federal action, for example, deploying the National Guard, and they think it is basically a political move. And for example, the LAPD is not a small police department. It's got, I think, around 9,000 members, and by contrast, Trump has called up 2,000 members of the National Guard, and there were only about 300 people on Sunday actually on the streets, it seemed, from the National Guard, and they were supplemented by many more police officers. So the idea that you needed troops was, debatable perhaps. And then even more incendiary, you had Pete Hegseth, who is the defense secretary, saying, well, we could also send US Marines from their garrison down the coast in. So that's the kind of most elite of the US Army, patrolling the streets of Los Angeles.
And I do want to come on to that in a second, but just in the first instance, I mean, we've talked about Trump sometimes maybe fleeting with the Constitution and what he's allowed to do with his power as president. Is he really allowed to deploy the National Guard in this way, especially when Gavin Newsom hasn't actually called on him to do that?
Well, this is the question that's going to come up over the next few days. So Gavin Newsom has promised to challenge it in the courts. I mean, even before all this, Gavin Newsom had predicted there would be legal showdowns with the executive, he'd set aside $50 million to, as he put it, Trump-proof California and basically put up legal fights. And he's going to challenge this decision by Trump to basically overrule him and deploy the National Guard. It's interesting that Trump at the moment has not invoked the Insurrectionary Act, which is a kind of piece of legislation from over 200 years ago, which basically gives the president sweeping authority to intervene and use the military on domestic American soil. But at the moment, he hasn't gone that far, and he's actually using other law, which appears to leave a bit of wiggle room for Newsom to kind of make his case.
And yeah, as you say, Trump has called this a form of rebellion, is the words he's used. I mean, is there evidence of that, or even just a sign of this escalating beyond just protests?
Well, Republicans have characterized it as an invasion of the number of illegal migrants, and California has the largest population, just over 2 million of undocumented migrants of any state in the US. And, they feel like those images of protesters waving Mexican flags justifies this rhetoric. They say this is a foreign country, these are foreign nationals who are, resisting law and order and US values, and that's why they think they're justified in kind of denouncing them. I think even Trump, even though he hasn't invoked the act I just told you about, did describe them as insurrectionists last night in one of his various kind of posts. So that's why they're making that case. Let's see what the courts say.
And LA is a city that has this status almost as being a sanctuary city. Could you explain to us a bit what that means? And is there any fear among Democrats or other sanctuary cities that this could kind of set a precedent?
Well, California in general and Los Angeles in particular is a democratic state, and it's a democratic city, and they don't believe in these kind of aggressive tactics that Trump has kind of tried to institute on a federal level. And that's how the Republicans would like to frame this debate. That said, ICE officials did arrest, I think, just over 100 people during raids last week. So they were obviously having some success at kind of rounding up illegal migrants and detaining them. But Trump has already run into various legal difficulties over his immigration policies. So there was this kind of notorious case of a man from El Salvador called Kilmar Abrego Garcia, who was deported back to El Salvador to a kind of mega jail, even though a judge had issued a kind of order giving him the right not to be deported. So then the Trump administration said, "Oh well, it was all an administrative error. We never kind of, we didn't plan to, we didn't mean to do this." And then they were kind of forced into this somewhat U-turn where he did return to the US, but then they claim the victory anyway. I mean, that is the kind of Trump mantra. Even if you're forced into a U-turn, claim the victory. Where they said we're going to pursue him for criminal charges for people trafficking after he was pulled over for a speeding offence while transporting people back in 2022. So he has become the kind of cause célèbre. He is the original case that has kind of galvanized people as an example of presidential overreach of the US government acting with apparent impunity to kind of arrest people and remove them even when they're not allowed to. And that's kind of fueled the fire of what we are now seeing in Los Angeles and across other cities.
And in the middle of all of this, there's this British photographer who, put simply, appears to have been shot by a sheriff's deputy. I mean, with some sort of, as you say, non-lethal round. What do we know about that?
Yeah, there's been and subsequent to that, there was an Australian journalist who was, the incident was caught on camera where she was shot by a rubber bullet. You could see the police officer firing it at her and her being hit. So, journalists kind of putting themselves in these situations do run the risk of this stuff. But for many, it's a sign of the kind of aggressive tactics that are being used to try and contain these protests that are kind of morphing into riots and leading to roads being shut down. That said, you have to say, when we see these images, and for Trump, those pictures are so powerful of burning cars and people waving Mexican flags, that doesn't tell the full story of actually what's happening in LA. In fact, this weekend there was a pretty uneventful Pride march that took place just around the corner from where these supposed riots were. It seemed to be pretty calm. I had a friend who was there who said it was all pretty calm. So the idea that this is some sort of apocalyptic scenario where America's breaking down is not entirely true, and perhaps it's a useful political way of presenting things.
And as you say, we mentioned the Marines earlier. From that optics perspective, I suppose on the face of it might make sense to deploy the National Guard. I mean, as you say, there are cars on fire in the streets. There does seem to have been some quite violent unrest. But deploying the U.S. Marines, who are now on standby, we understand, that actually would be quite a big escalation, wouldn't it?
Yeah, like you say, it's the reputation of the Marines in particular. One of the most elite units of the U.S. military being sent to kind of quash protesters. That's a hell of a message to send. Let's see if it actually happens. I mean, Pete Hegseth since becoming U.S. Defense Secretary, his approach has been political. He has, for example, kind of renamed most recently a whole suite of ships that were about to be named after civil rights figures, and he has banned transgender people from serving in the military. So his approach has been to kind of lean into those culture wars and political arguments and use the military in that way.
Well, I want to come away from those protests for now, George, and discuss this fallout that still seems to be developing between Elon Musk and Trump. How has this escalated to the point of Elon calling for Donald Trump to be impeached?
Well, it seemed to be a kind of slow burn, but I mean, the start of it was Trump's big beautiful bill, as he calls it, and Musk's concerns about how that would kind of inflate the US deficit, and you'd add basically trillions extra to the deficit for tax cuts that he thought weren't necessary. Others who are more cynical say that, well, in the big beautiful bill as well, there are also subsidies for electric vehicles that are being cut, and maybe Musk, as the owner of Tesla, has an interest in kind of trying to avert that. Anyway, so he started about a week and a half ago. I mean, it already feels like years ago, criticizing the big beautiful bill and laying that out in public. Then kind of Trump and Musk had this press conference in the Oval Office where Trump was very nice about Musk. Musk seemed to have a black eye. He said he'd been punched by his kid. And they basically, it was very cordial. And the whole point was that the message was we best of friends. And even though we're going our separate ways, we're all happy. But then once Musk had in fact left government and kind of ended Doge, he then ended up launching this kind of absolute bevy of messages attacking the big beautiful bill. Trump was kind of forced to respond, and then you had this tit for tat exchange on the two pairs social media platforms. So Musk owns X, so he was posting on X, and Trump Truth Social. So Trump was posting on Truth Social, where they were kind of going at each other ham and tongs. So it was then that you got to the point where Musk was saying, oh, Trump is named in the Jeffrey Epstein files. Trump should be impeached and be replaced by J.D. Vance. Actually, since then, he seems to have kind of backed down and removed some of those more incendiary posts, deleted them. And indeed, he's actually retweeted Trump and kind of shared, basically endorsed his approach to handling the Los Angeles riots. But Trump has said, this is a relationship that I have no interest in repairing. I think we've burned all our bridges here, and also sending out a warning to Musk that if he donates to the Democrats, then he'll be dead to him, and there are serious consequences.
Where does all of this leave Doge then? That sort of almost non-governmental department that has been set up to strip out some of the US's overspending as they'd like to see it.
Well, Musk laid off a lot of kind of American, effectively civil servants, but the issue is that government reform is boring, and it takes a lot of time, and finding efficiency savings. This is not glamorous work, and it takes a lot of kind of hanging around the swamp, as Washington DC is called, to actually kind of have an effect. So it appeared that Musk perhaps didn't have the patience, but also he didn't have the authority. It was a battle to get a hold of certain elements of government, and a battle that he ultimately seemed to fail. And I think there was a bit of a power struggle in the court of Trump. Trump also had, for example, Susie Wiles, his chief of staff, who was kind of seen as a curbing influence on Musk's authority, and an alternate kind of power behind the scenes. And she certainly appears to have kind of won that battle, and edged out Musk, who was seen as a bit of a disruptor.
And so will Doge continue without Musk, or is that pretty much it now for that organization?
Remains to be seen. I mean, quite possibly. I mean, I think it's still technically there, but I think Doge staffers themselves are now fearful that they'll get doged and they'll get cut and go with Trump's agenda. So let's see.
And I just want to use one of the quotes from your article from Donald Trump. He talked about why he wouldn't now seek to mend ties with Elon Musk. He's used the term that Musk, you shouldn't disrespect the president, and that's somehow unprecedented. But it seems a bit confusing coming from Donald Trump, a man who's repeatedly insulted former and when he was campaigning current US presidents, doesn't it?
Well, this is Trump's personal opinions. That's what he's going to say. He's going to vent. I just think that if Musk is going to cause him a problem, then he's going to hit back, isn't he? So you have this tussle between the world's richest man and the world's most powerful man, and they're squabbling in a way that many parents of young children would find familiar. But that is politics at the end of the day, and it always does come down to personalities.
Well, George Grylls, Washington correspondent for The Times, thank you very much for joining me today on the Trump Report.
Thank you.